On the morning of April 24th, 2018, investigators parked outside a house in Citrus Heights, a quiet suburb of Sacramento, California, and waited for the man inside to take out his trash. The house was unremarkable, a single-story ranch-style home on an ordinary suburban street, the kind of house that exists in thousands of identical versions across the Sacramento Valley. There was a driveway. There was a lawn. There were neighbors on either side who had lived next to this man for years without knowing anything unusual about him, except perhaps that he was somewhat antisocial, that he did not invite much conversation, that he seemed to prefer to be left alone. The investigators had been watching him for weeks. They knew his schedule. When he walked to the mailbox, when he drove to the grocery store, when he took out the recycling, what time of day he was most likely to be in the front yard. They had conducted the surveillance with meticulous care, staying far enough away and changing positions often enough that no pattern would register to a man who had spent decades watching for patterns in other people's routines. They could not afford to tip him off. They had to be absolutely certain before they moved. What they needed was his DNA. They already had DNA. They had DNA collected from crime scenes 40 years earlier, from rape kits, from physical evidence at murder scenes, from the trace biological material that a person leaves behind when they break into houses and attack people and leave without knowing exactly what they've left. That DNA had been sitting in evidence rooms and laboratory databases for 4 decades, waiting for the technology that could use it. Now, they had a name. They needed to confirm it. The man living in that house was 72 years old. He was a retired police officer. He had 3 adult daughters and grandchildren. He had worked as a truck mechanic for the last 3 decades of his professional life after being fired from police work in 1979, not for his crimes, which remained entirely unknown, but for shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent from a supermarket. He had lived in the Sacramento area for most of his adult life, in the same quiet suburban geography where 40 years earlier he had conducted one of the most prolific and sustained criminal campaigns in California history. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. When he stepped into his driveway that morning and discarded a tissue, the investigators watching from a distance retrieved it after he went back inside. They took the tissue to a laboratory. The laboratory analyzed the DNA from the tissue and compared it to the DNA profile that had been sitting in the evidence database since the 1970s. The profiles were identical. On April 24th, 2018, investigators surrounded Joseph DeAngelo in his driveway. He was wearing a bathrobe. He seemed confused, not frightened exactly, but the confused look of a man who does not immediately understand what is happening, who has perhaps never genuinely contemplated the possibility that the morning would arrive like this. He was 72 years old. He had been the East Area rapist. He had been the original Night Stalker. He had been the Golden State Killer. He had been for 40 years the most wanted unidentified serial criminal in California history. He had also been the man in the bathrobe. He had been both things simultaneously every day for 4 decades. Until the tissue. This is not a story about a criminal who was impossible to catch. It is worth saying that plainly, because the 40 years between 1978 and 2018 can produce a false impression of impossibility. Joseph DeAngelo was not a master criminal who had constructed an escape-proof methodology. He was a person who committed crimes in an era before the technology existed to identify him, who left evidence that was completely sufficient to convict him, DNA, fingerprints, survivor descriptions, at a time when that evidence could not be matched to any name. He was caught the moment the technology caught up to him. It took 3 months from the initial upload of crime scene DNA to GED match to his arrest. 3 months to do what 40 years of investigation had been unable to accomplish. because the tool that was needed had not existed until 2018. This means that the 40 years were not 40 years of investigative failure. They were 40 years of waiting for the technology, but the 40 years happened to real people. They happened to the women he attacked, who spent 40 years knowing that the man who had broken into their house and tied them up and spent hours with them had never been identified, had never been charged, might have been anyone, might have been their neighbor, might have been someone they had passed in a grocery store. The specific quality of that knowledge, not knowing the face that went with what had been done to them, is something that survivors of his attacks described in ways that are worth understanding. A woman who was attacked in the late 1970s and who came to his sentencing hearing decades later described what it had meant to not know. She had spent years looking at men in the Sacramento area and wondering. Every tall man in a store, every man at a gas station who looked approximately right. The wondering had never stopped. It had become a background condition of her daily life, a low-level hyper-vigilance that she had managed and adapted to and that had shaped her choices. Where she lived, how she locked her doors, who she trusted, for 4 decades. When she learned that the man was Joseph DeAngelo, retired police officer, Citrus Heights, that the man who had broken into her house was this specific person with this specific name, this specific address, this specific unremarkable life. She said that what she felt was not relief. It was something more complicated. She knew who he was now. The wondering would stop. But the 40 years of wondering had already happened. They could not be taken back. The family members of the people he killed had a different kind of weight to carry. The murders of the original Night Stalker were, for the families who experienced them, unsolved, violent deaths, the particular category of loss that generates not only grief, but the specific additional burden of not knowing who was responsible and whether that person would strike again. Some of the family members had spent decades advocating for attention to the case, for resources, for the investigative effort to continue. Some had become involved in victim advocacy work. Some had simply carried the knowledge of an unsolved murder in their family history through everything else they had lived. The arrest did not undo the loss. Nothing undid the loss. What it did was provide a specific answer to a question that had been open for 30 or 40 years. Who was responsible? The answer was Joseph DeAngelo. He had been living in the Sacramento suburbs while they were carrying the question. He had been mowing the lawn. The story of the Golden State Killer is a story about time, about what 40 years of unidentified crimes does to the people who survived them and the families of the people who did not, about what an investigation looks like when the evidence exists, but the technology to use it does not. About a woman named Michelle McNamara who spent years of her life trying to find him and died before she found out who he was. And about the morning in April when a 72-year-old retired police officer stepped into his driveway in a bathrobe, and the technology that had not existed when he committed his crimes reached backward through 40 years and put a name to what he was. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. was born on November 8, 1945, in Bath, New York, a small town in the Finger Lakes region. His father served in the Air Force, which moved the family periodically through his childhood, including a period in Germany and eventually to California, where they settled in the Sacramento Valley. He graduated from Folsom High School in 1964, served in the United States Navy during the Vietnam War era, and afterward enrolled at California State University, Sacramento, to study criminal justice. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. He became a police officer. The specific path from that degree to the crimes he committed is not one that has been cleanly documented. There is no clear record of when the crimes began relative to his professional development, no journal entries or confessions that describe the emergence of what he was. What is documented is the timeline, The burglaries in Visalia began while he was an officer at Exeter. The rapes in Sacramento began after he transferred to Auburn. The murders in Southern California occurred in the years immediately following his termination from Auburn. He was a police officer for 6 years, from 1973 to 1979, and he committed crimes throughout that period and after it. The specific irony of his police work, that he ran an anti-burglary program at Exeter while conducting a burglary campaign that police in Visalia could not solve, is worth understanding in detail. The Joint Attack on Burglary program was a proactive effort by the Exeter Police Department to reduce residential break-ins through community outreach, increased patrols in high-risk areas, and better coordination with other agencies. DeAngelo, as its coordinator and later its sergeant, would have had regular access to information about how residential burglaries were investigated, what evidence investigators looked for, what patterns they tracked, what techniques were most likely to produce a suspect. He used this knowledge in the crimes he committed. The Visalia ransacker was notable precisely for the things he did not leave behind. He did not take large valuables that would be immediately reported stolen, did not leave fingerprints in the places investigators would look first, did not establish patterns that could be tracked through conventional police analysis. His crimes had the specific quality of someone who knew what investigators looked for and avoided leaving it. The same quality appeared in his rape attacks and murders. He left DNA. You could not conduct the kind of extended physical attacks he conducted over a decade without leaving biological material. But DNA analysis was not the investigative tool in 1976 and 1977 that it would eventually become. The fingerprints he left at some scenes were partial and could not be matched without a candidate to compare them against. The footprints he left suggested an athletic man with a specific shoe size, but shoe size is not identification. The survivor descriptions produced composite sketches, but composite sketches require a candidate to compare them against. He had constructed, whether deliberately or instinctively, a profile that could not be resolved with the tools available at the time. He was not identified when investigators found him in a database. He was not in any relevant database. He was identified only when the technology of familial DNA searching made it possible to work backward from distant relatives to a family tree to a specific individual. This is the quality that makes the Golden State Killer case significant beyond its individual horror. He was not more clever than other criminals. He was simply operating in a world where the technology to identify him did not yet exist. The evidence that identified him had been sitting in evidence rooms since the 1970s. The only thing that changed between 1986, when his known crimes ended, and 2018, when he was arrested, was the technology. After his termination from the Auburn Police Department in 1979, fired for the hammer and the dog repellent, a misdemeanor that cost him his badge while his actual crimes remained entirely unknown, DeAngelo took a job as a truck mechanic for a grocery distribution company. He married a woman named Sharon Huddle, who was a lawyer. They had 3 daughters. They lived in the Sacramento suburbs. Sharon Huddle filed for divorce in 1991. The reasons for the divorce are not fully documented in public records. She was a lawyer. She had 3 daughters with him. She had lived with him for years. Whether she knew anything, suspected anything, or was simply leaving a difficult marriage for ordinary reasons, none of this is established in the available record. He continued living in the Sacramento area after the divorce. He continued mowing his lawn and taking out his trash and being, to the neighbors who nodded to him on the street, the somewhat antisocial retired man in the house on the corner. He had not been a suspect in the Golden State Killer investigation. His name had not appeared in the case files. He had not been flagged by any of the investigative methods available to the dozens of agencies that had worked the case over the decades. He was simply a person living in Sacramento who had once been a police officer. who had once committed crimes that nobody had connected to him, who was 72 years old and had grandchildren, until the tissue. The crimes had begun, or the crimes that were eventually attributed to DeAngelo had begun in 1974. The first phase was the burglaries. In Visalia, a city in the Central Valley of California, flat, agricultural, the kind of place where the streets end at orchards and the nights are quiet. Between 1974 and 1975, a series of residential burglaries were committed that had a specific and unusual quality. The burglar did not take the most valuable items in the houses he entered. He took personal items, a single piece of jewelry, a photograph, small objects that meant something to the residents and would not be obviously missed until later. He moved things. He rearranged drawers and closets in ways that suggested he was studying the people who lived there rather than simply taking their property. The Visalia ransacker, as the local press named him, committed over 100 burglaries between 1974 and 1975. He was never caught in Visalia. In September of 1975, a college professor named Claude Snelling woke in the night and found the ransacker in his home, attempting to remove his teenage daughter through a bedroom window. Snelling chased the intruder outside and was shot twice in the chest. He died in his front yard. His daughter escaped and ran back inside. Claude Snelling was the first person DeAngelo is confirmed to have killed. DeAngelo was working as a police officer in Exeter, 10 miles away at the time. The second phase began in June of 1976, when a man broke into a house in Rancho Cordova, a working-class Sacramento suburb of tract homes and flat streets, and attacked a woman who was sleeping alone. It was not random. The woman had been watched. Her routines had been studied. He knew when she was home and when she was alone. He came back. He attacked in other suburbs: Carmichael, Citrus Heights, Orangevale, Fair Oaks. Over the following 2 years, he attacked women across the Sacramento metropolitan area with a regularity and a method that produced a specific quality of fear in the communities he moved through. Women who lived alone double-locked their doors. Couples moved their beds away from windows. The Sacramento Bee ran articles with headlines about the rapist the police couldn't catch. The East Area rapist was methodical in ways that distinguished him from the ordinary violent offender. He did not attack impulsively. He stalked. He sometimes spent days watching a neighborhood before choosing a target, noting who came and went, who lived alone when the lights went on and off. He sometimes broke into a house before the night he intended to attack and prepared it, unlocking a window, leaving a ligature behind a sofa cushion, testing the access routes. When he attacked couples, his staging was theatrical in a specific and calculated way. He would bind the male partner face down on the floor of a hallway or a bathroom and stack dishes on his back. He told the man that if he moved and the dishes fell, he would kill the woman in the other room. Then he would take the woman, sometimes for hours. He sometimes ate food from the refrigerator between attacks, the sound of him opening the refrigerator door audible through the walls. He taunted. In March of 1977, he called a police tip line and said, "I have my next victim already stalked, and you guys can't catch me." That same day, he attacked. He called victims after their assaults, not immediately but weeks or months later, to remind them that he knew where they lived, that he knew their name, that he could come back whenever he chose. He sent letters to newspapers and to the Sacramento mayor describing his crimes and his intentions. He seemed to enjoy the investigation as much as the crimes themselves. He was performing for the audience of law enforcement and the public, shaping the narrative, inserting himself into the fear he was generating in a way that went beyond the ordinary calculus of a criminal avoiding capture. And in all of this, the stalking, the letters, the phone calls, the theatrical staging of his attacks, he left DNA. He left it at crime scene after crime scene on a decade of evidence, accumulating in the databases of California law enforcement as an anonymous genetic profile that said, This person exists. These crimes were committed by the same person, and somewhere in California, this person is living a life. It would take 42 years to find the life. The East Area Rapist was never caught in Sacramento. In late 1979, the attacks in Northern California stopped. In Southern California, they started. The original Night Stalker, a name applied years later by investigators to distinguish him from Richard Ramirez, who was still years away from his own crimes when this person was operating, began attacking couples in the wealthy coastal communities of Santa Barbara County and then moved into Orange County, Ventura County, and Los Angeles County. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had studied the East Area Rapist cases in Sacramento, but the investigators in Southern California did not know the East Area Rapist cases. There was no mechanism in 1979 and 1980 for connecting a rape series in Sacramento County with a murder series in Orange County. He changed tactics in the South. He murdered. The original Night Stalker killed primarily, broke into houses at night, attacked couples, and killed both of them. He killed Brian and Katie Maggiore in Rancho Cordova in February of 1978, still in the Northern California phase. He killed Robert Offerman and Alexandria Manning in December of 1979 in Goleta, outside Santa Barbara. He killed Lyman and Charlene Smith in Ventura in March of 1980. He killed Keith and Patrice Harrington in Dana Point in August of 1980. He killed Manuela Withun in Irvine in February of 1981. He killed Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in Goleta in July of 1981. His last confirmed murder was Janelle Cruz in May of 1986, an 18-year-old woman in Irvine whose house he entered on a Sunday afternoon while her family was away. She was found by a neighbor. The murders in Southern California stopped in 1986. Whether he stopped, whether he was incapacitated by something, whether he simply decided it was over, none of this was known until he was identified. In 2001, DNA analysis made the connection that the investigators of 2 separate decades and 2 separate regions of California had not been able to make. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. The same DNA at both sets of crime scenes. The same person who had attacked women in Sacramento in 1976 and 1977 and 1978 had killed couples in Santa Barbara in 1979 and in Orange County in 1980. The same person. A decade of crimes in 2 phases connected by biology. The connection was made 22 years after the crimes had begun. It would take 17 more years to put a name to the biology. The person whose DNA connected both sets of crimes had, by 2001, been retired for several years. He was living in the Sacramento suburbs. He was mowing his lawn. He did not know that the evidence in 2 evidence rooms, 300 miles apart, had just been linked to each other and to him. He would not find out for another 17 years. He had 16 years left to mow the lawn and say hello to the neighbors and be the unremarkable retired man in the house on the corner before a genealogy database and a tissue in his driveway finally resolved the question that had been open since June of 1976. He was an investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, assigned to the forensic laboratory and the cold case unit, and he had been handed a file that had not produced an arrest in nearly 2 decades. He would spend the next 24 years working it, through 2 positions in California law enforcement, through thousands of hours of analysis, through the succession of technological transitions that changed what DNA evidence could accomplish and which databases could be queried. Holes was not the only investigator who worked the case over the decades. Multiple agencies across California maintained active interest in the Golden State Killer. Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, Orange County, Santa Barbara County, Ventura County, others. And there were investigators at many of these agencies who worked individual aspects of the case at different times. But Holmes became, over the years, the investigator most publicly identified with the sustained, unrelenting effort to close it. He kept coming back. He kept finding new angles. He tested the available technology as it developed repeatedly to determine whether it had advanced far enough to close the gap between the evidence they had and the identification they needed. For most of those 24 years, the gap was too wide. They had DNA from multiple crime scenes, biological material left behind across a decade of attacks in 2 parts of California, preserved in evidence rooms and forensic databases, representing a complete and specific genetic profile of the unknown subject. They had fingerprints from some scenes. They had footprints. They had the composite sketches built from survivor descriptions, assembled into a physical profile. White male, approximately 6 feet tall, athletic build, blue eyes, possibly a military background based on the precision of his movements and the specific quality of his methods. What they lacked was any way to take that genetic profile and find the name attached to it in the world. The DNA databases that law enforcement could legally search, CODIS, and its state-level equivalents, contained the DNA profiles of people who had been arrested or convicted of crimes. Joseph DeAngelo had been convicted of 1 misdemeanor shoplifting offense in 1979 and nothing else. His DNA was not in the system. He was invisible to every search that could legally be conducted. The case sat, not abandoned, never abandoned, but sitting, year after year, waiting for the technology to change. In 2017 and early 2018, Holmes was approaching retirement from his second career position. He had one more idea. He had been watching the development of commercial genealogy DNA databases, the services that people were using to find their ancestors and connect with distant relatives. The databases that contained millions of voluntarily submitted genetic profiles and the family trees that people had built around them. GEDmatch, one of the largest such databases, was publicly accessible and allowed users to compare their genetic data with other profiles in the database to find relatives. Holmes knew that if the Golden State Killer had any relatives who had submitted their DNA to GEDmatch, even distant relatives, third cousins or fourth cousins whose families had diverged from the killer's family tree generations earlier, there might be a partial genetic match, not an identification but a starting point. He uploaded the crime scene DNA profile to GEDmatch. The database returned partial matches, people whose genetic profiles overlapped with the Golden State Killers at the level of distant cousinship. From those distant relatives working with genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, investigators began constructing family trees, building backward through the census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses and death records that genealogical research requires, then building forward again through the descendant branches, mapping out the possible male relatives of the right age living in the right geographic area. The work took months. It required the combination of biological analysis and traditional genealogical research that was, in 2018, still an emerging methodology, one that had not yet been applied to a major criminal case. Ray Venter was building the technique as she applied it. The family trees narrowed, the possible suspects narrowed. Eventually, the list of male relatives of the right age in the right area contained a specific name. Joseph DeAngelo, retired police officer, Citrus Heights, Sacramento County. Investigators began watching him. They watched him for weeks, confirming that his physical characteristics matched the established profile, confirming his location, confirming that the ordinary suburban retired man living in that ordinary house in that ordinary suburb was the person the mathematics of family trees and genetic analysis had identified. They waited for DNA confirmation. He discarded a tissue. The past met the present that day, said Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. The technology that had made that meeting possible deserves more than a paragraph. It deserves understanding, because what happened between a GED match database and a driveway in Citrus Heights is the thing that will define criminal investigation for the next generation. When investigators uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GED Match in early 2018, they were looking for partial matches, the kind of genetic overlap that occurs between people who share common ancestors several generations back. Your DNA shares about 12% with a first cousin, about 3% with a second cousin, less than 1% with a third or fourth cousin. But even a fraction of a percent is enough to establish a genetic connection, to say that these two people descend from the same ancestral line, even if that line diverged 4 or 5 generations ago. GED Match returned a set of partial matches. People whose family trees overlapped with the unknown subject's DNA at the level of distant cousinhood. None of them was the killer. All of them were related to the killer by blood. Genetic genealogist Barbara Ray Venter began building family trees from those partial matches. She traced backward through census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses and death records, reconstructing the ancestral branches that the partial DNA matches identified. Then she built forward, following the descendant lines, mapping out the male relatives who might be the right age and the right physical type and who had lived in the right part of California during the right years. The process took months. It produced a very long list that got shorter as each candidate was checked against the physical profile. Most were too young. Most were in the wrong place. Most were the wrong height, or the wrong build, or had the wrong eye color. Each elimination left a shorter list. Eventually, the list contained Joseph DeAngelo. The confirmation that DeAngelo's tissue matched the crime scene DNA was, in the language of forensic science, a statistically certain match. Not probable, not likely, but certain to a degree that left no reasonable scientific alternative. The DNA from the tissue and the DNA from the 1970s crime scenes came from the same person. C.C. Moore, one of the leading practitioners of genetic genealogy, said afterward, "We found a way to make the dead speak." She meant the stored biological evidence. 40 years of DNA sitting in California evidence rooms, waiting for a technology that could translate it into a name. The translation took 3 months. It took 3 months to do what 40 years had been unable to do because the tool had not existed. Michelle McNamara was a true crime writer who had become, over several years, consumed by the Golden State Killer case in the specific and total way that this particular case seemed to generate in the people who spent enough time with it. It was not the casual fascination of a true crime fan listening to a podcast while commuting. It was the kind of absorption that reorganized her time and her sleep and her sense of what was important, that turned her kitchen table into a research station covered in case files, that sent her down research threads at midnight that she would follow until 3 or 4 in the morning. She had grown up in the Chicago suburbs with no particular connection to California, but she had encountered the case in the late 2000s. Through the combination of public records, survivor accounts, and online forum discussions of true crime enthusiasts that had kept the case alive in the years when the formal investigation seemed to have stalled. She had started a blog, True Crime Diary, in 2006. She had written pieces that were noticed by readers who appreciated that she brought genuine literary skill to subject matter that most true crime writing handled clumsily. In 2013, she published a long article in Los Angeles magazine titled "In the Footsteps of a Killer," a deep investigation of the Golden State Killer case that introduced her voice and her approach to a much larger audience. The article was specific and carefully sourced, and written with the kind of literary sensibility that true crime had rarely seen. It did not exploit the horror or the victims, but it did not sanitize them either, and it described the specific quality of a case that had everything investigators needed, except the one thing they could not provide: a name. She was writing a book. She had accumulated 37 boxes of case files. She corresponded with investigators. She had developed through years of research a specific and detailed theory about who the killer was. Not a name, but a profile, a set of characteristics and behavioral patterns that she believed would match the right person when he was found. She was married to the comedian Patton Oswalt. She had a daughter. She lived in Los Angeles. She was 46 years old. On April 21, 2016, she died in her sleep. She had taken an accidental combination of prescription medications, Adderall, and anti-anxiety medication that she had been managing for some time, along with fentanyl that had been mixed into other drugs she had obtained that she had not known was there. The specific combination produced respiratory depression while she slept. She died without waking. Her husband found her in the morning. The book she had been writing was unfinished. Patton Oswalt and two of her research collaborators, Paul Haynes and Billy Jensen, who had been working the case alongside her, took her 37 boxes of files and her draft chapters and the thousands of notes she had left and assembled them into the book she had been building. They published it in February of 2018. The book was called "I'll Be Gone in the Dark." The phrase came from something the Golden State Killer had said to one of his victims during an attack in the late 1970s. He had whispered to a woman he had tied up in the dark of her own bedroom, in the house he had broken into while she slept, "You'll be silent forever, and I'll be gone in the dark." He had been almost right. He had been gone in the dark for 40 years. The book became an immediate bestseller. It renewed public attention on the case at a moment when investigators were, as it happened, weeks away from the breakthrough. The media pressure that the book's success generated, the interviews, the features, the renewed public interest in who the Golden State Killer was not meaningless. It contributed to the visibility of the investigation, the pressure on law enforcement agencies to produce results, the general cultural moment in which the arrest happened. She had been dead for 2 years when Joseph DeAngelo was arrested in his driveway. 8 weeks after her book was published. In the final chapter of the book, the chapter she had written in the last months before her death, imagining what it would feel like to finally confront him, she addressed him directly. "Open the door. Show us your face. Walk into the light." He walked into the light on April 24, 2018, in a bathrobe, 72 years old. She never knew. Patton Oswalt spoke about the arrest in interviews in the days that followed. He said that he was glad she had named him. He said that the name she had given him, the Golden State Killer, not the East Area Rapist, not the original Night Stalker, not Aaron's, was the name that had stuck, the name the media used, the name on the warrants that were read to DeAngelo in his driveway. She had given the case its final identity and its final momentum, and she had done it posthumously, and she had not been there to see the door open. Her daughter was 12 years old when the arrest was announced. Joseph DeAngelo pleaded guilty on June 29, 2020, to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping with robbery. He had been facing the possibility of the death penalty in California, and the plea agreement removed that possibility in exchange for his admission of guilt to the charged crimes and his acknowledgement of guilt in many additional uncharged crimes. The rapes that California's statute of limitations prevented prosecutors from charging him with directly. He stood in Sacramento Superior Court in a wheelchair and said guilty to each count as they were read. He said it 13 times. On August 18, 2020, the sentencing hearing began. It was unlike any proceeding most of the people present had witnessed, not primarily because of the legal formalities, which were standard, but because of the 2 days that preceded the formal sentencing, during which survivors of his attacks and family members of people he had killed were given time to address him directly. 40 years. Some of these people had been waiting 40 years to be in the same room with the person who had broken into their house, had tied them up, had taken whatever he had chosen to take. Some of the family members had spent decades not knowing who had killed their parents or their children. Some had grown up with the shadow of an unsolved violent crime in their family history, and the shadow had shaped them in ways they were still processing. They came to the microphone, one by one. Over 2 days. A woman named Chris Pedretti had been raped by DeAngelo in 1976 when she was 18 years old. She was 62 when she stood at the microphone at his sentencing hearing. She said, "I've waited 44 years for this moment. You don't deserve to be called the Golden State Killer. Your name is Joseph James DeAngelo, and you are a coward." She paused. "But I am not afraid of you." A woman named Carol Daly, one of the detectives who had worked the East Area rapist cases in Sacramento in the 1970s, and who had spent years as a volunteer advocate for victims of violent crime, spoke about what it had been like to work the case in 1977, to interview the women he had attacked, to watch the investigation be unable to close. She was in her 80s. She had waited a long time. The daughter of one of his murder victims had been a child when her parents were killed by the original Night Stalker. She stood at the microphone and told him what her childhood had been like after that. She told him what the decades had been like. She described in specific and unsparing terms the specific quality of a life shaped by the violent death of parents at the hands of an unidentified man. DeAngelo sat in his wheelchair throughout the 2 days of statements, occasionally moving his hands, occasionally appearing to shift in his chair, giving no visible sign of what, if anything, he was experiencing while the people he had damaged described what he had done to them. At the end of the second day, when all the statements had been given, he was given the opportunity to speak. He stood with effort from his wheelchair. He was 74 years old. He faced the courtroom. He said, "I have listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I am truly sorry to everyone I have harmed. The people in that courtroom, the survivors, the family members, the investigators who had spent careers working the case, the journalists who had covered it, received those words in the various ways that people receive an apology that has come 40 years too late. Some found them meaningful, some found them inadequate, some found them enraging." Several survivors said afterward that watching him stand and speak those words was nothing like what they had imagined it would be. Smaller, somehow, and less resolved, and not the ending they had expected. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at R.J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. He is 79 years old. He will die in prison. The Golden State Killer case is studied in law enforcement training programs and forensic science curricula, not primarily as a story about the crimes themselves, which were horrific and well documented, but as a story about the future of criminal investigation. Genetic genealogy, the technique that identified DeAngelo, had been developed by genealogical researchers over the preceding decade, but its application to criminal investigation was new. The DeAngelo case was its first major test, and the test was successful in the most unambiguous possible way. A 72-year-old retired police officer who had committed crimes for 12 years and evaded identification for 40. was arrested within months of the technique being applied. In the years following DeAngelo's arrest, genetic genealogy was used to identify suspects in hundreds of cold cases across the country. Rapists and murderers who had evaded identification for decades, whose DNA sat in evidence rooms waiting for technology that could use it, were identified and arrested. The technique proved to be effective beyond what its early advocates had claimed, and its application expanded rapidly. It also generated a debate that has not been resolved. The genealogy databases used to identify DeAngelo, GED match primarily, but also others, were built from the voluntary DNA submissions of people who were trying to trace their ancestry, connect with distant relatives, build family trees. When they submitted their DNA to GED match, they agreed to the database's terms of service, which at the time of the DeAngelo investigation did not include a specific provision about law enforcement use. They had shared their genetic information to find cousins, not to help solve homicides. Privacy advocates pointed out that the technique meant that submitting your DNA to a genealogy database was not a personal decision about yourself alone. It was potentially a decision about every genetic relative you had, including relatives who had committed crimes and whose DNA might now be traceable through yours. A person who had never submitted their DNA to any database, who had carefully protected their genetic privacy, could be identified as a criminal suspect if a distant cousin submitted theirs. The debate produced changes in database policy. GED Match changed its terms of service to allow users to opt in or out of law enforcement searches, then changed them again to restrict law enforcement searches to investigations of violent crimes only. The legal framework governing the use of genealogy databases for criminal investigations varied by state and continued to evolve. The tension between the undeniable investigative value of the technique and the privacy implications of its use remained unresolved. Paul Holes, asked about the privacy concerns in interviews after his retirement, acknowledged them without dismissing them. The technique had identified a person responsible for 13 murders. The privacy implications were real and legitimate. Both things were true simultaneously, and the question of how to balance them was a policy question that law enforcement investigators were not the right people to answer alone. The Golden State Killer wasn't caught by luck, Michelle McNamara had written before she knew it was possible. He was caught by persistence and science. She was right about the science. She was right about the persistence. She had contributed to both. The ghost had been living in Citrus Heights. The persistence was 24 years of Paul Holes and 40 years of investigators who never closed the file. The science was a tissue and a genealogy database and a genetic genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter who built family trees until they pointed at a house in Sacramento. He mowed the lawn. He said hello to the neighbors for 40 years until the tissue. What does it mean that this is what the Golden State Killer looked like at the end? Not a man in hiding, not a man on the run, not a man who seemed, to the people who encountered him, to be carrying anything heavier than the ordinary burdens of getting old. He was antisocial. He preferred to be left alone. But he was not visibly haunted. He was a retired truck mechanic with a lawn. The neighbor who spoke to reporters after the arrest said he had seemed like a quiet, private man, that he had not caused problems, that you would not have guessed anything. You would not have guessed anything. He ran an anti-burglary program while committing burglaries. He wore a badge while committing the crimes that badge was supposed to prevent. He was fired for stealing a hammer and lost his job, and the crimes the badge had helped conceal continued for 7 more years after he was no longer a police officer. He lived in Sacramento, the same city where he had attacked 50 women, for the rest of his working life and into retirement, and nobody saw it. The woman who named him, who wrote in the last chapter of her last book, addressing him directly, Open the door, show us your face, walk into the light. We'll be remembered longer than he will. She found him. She just didn't get to know it. Joseph DeAngelo is 79 years old. He is in prison in San Diego. He will die there, having lived longer than Michelle McNamara, longer than several of his victims, longer than the time between his last confirmed crime and his arrest. He told a woman in the dark of her own bedroom in 1977, "You'll be silent forever, and I'll be gone in the dark." He was not gone. He was in Citrus Heights, mowing the lawn.